Okay, we're starting our second phase of our presentations for our brake systems. Okay, so last week we talked about brake systems in general. Okay, this included brake pedals, brake boosters, master cylinders, brake lines, brake fluid, right? Basically all the stuff that mechanically is involved with you interacting with the brake system and it actually sending that force through hydraulic systems to the actual devices doing the braking. We did touch a little bit on calipers and drum brakes and things along those lines in that system, but that was a very general overview. This week what we're going to do is we're really going to focus in on specifically disc brakes, okay? And this is getting us prepped up and ready to go out in the shop to actually service disc brake systems. So we're going to get into the nitty and gritty on this over the next couple days, all right? But before we do, just a couple reminders that we do have a new Ford Ace that has been assigned starting today. It is due on Friday at midnight. It is the brake system overview. Again, all you need to do is go into highschool.fordservicetraining.com, log in with your username and password, search up brake system overview. It should be the first lesson that pops up. Go through that lesson, watch it, rewatch it, take notes if you need to. Get your study guide packet out, follow along if there's any vocab words that are in that packet that show up there. Feel free to jot down any type of information that you deem necessary or important for the future summative assessment that we're going to do. Okay? Once you get done with that lesson, go back into Google Classroom. There's a Google form that you can open, and that's going to be your formative assessment for making sure that you communicate with me that you completed that lesson. Okay, and those are obviously scored, given points and grades in the grade book. Okay, and again, I know I've already said this earlier, but the brake system notes summary is due tonight, midnight. So find some time either during school today or after school to complete that 5 to 10 minute assignment. All right. So there we go with that. I'm gonna scoot this over. Okay, let's see here. Disc brakes. Here's our standards. A lot of standards on this particular one. Okay, there's a lot of information to cover on disc brakes in and of themselves. So again, I'm not asking you to write all this stuff down. I'm asking you to pick one of these standards. All right, and I want you to write an essential question down: who, what, why, when, where, how, in regards to something on here that you probably don't know about. This is going to help direct your focus on your learning as we go through this. Some of this information, by the way, we're going to touch base on in the presentation, but you're going to interact with it physically out in the shop when you're actually doing the disc brake service. So that's an additional learning opportunity for you to be able to kind of solidify anything that right now you know you don't know. So again, we're still identifying brake system components and configurations. We're going to continue that from last week. Installing wheel and torquing lug nuts, that's nothing new, but it's still the same standard that we need to be able to hit on, and you'll see why that's so critical with brakes. Remove and clean caliper assembly, inspect for leaks and damage and wear. Okay, so again, we're going to dig into the caliper assembly itself, the different parts that make up that caliper. Let's see, inspect the caliper mounting and slide pins for proper operation, wear and damage. Remove, inspect, and or replace brake pads and retaining hardware. Again, we kind of touched base with this a little bit last week, but now we're going to get into it further. Lubricate and reinstall the caliper, brake pads, and related hardware. We're going to seat the brake pads against the rotor, and we're going to inspect for leaks. If you don't know what seating the brake pads is against the rotor, that is a perfect opportunity for you to write down an essential question. What is seating brake pads against rotor mean? Boom. There you go. That's a free one. Clean and inspect the rotor and mounting surface. Measure rotor thickness, thickness variation, and lateral runout. What is lateral runout? Boy, that is the simplest essential question that you could potentially write down. Remove and reinstall, replace a rotor. Retract and readjust the caliper piston on an integral parking brake system. Describe the importance of operating vehicles to burnish/break-in replacement brake pads according to manufacturer's recommendations. What does it mean when we say burnish or break-in replacement brake pads? What is that process, right? What is the process to break in brake pads? Again, another essential question. So just me reading through that, I came up with 3 questions that most people probably don't know, and it would be awesome to learn about because we're going to. Okay? Yes, sir.
Could you send that back to me?
Not right now.
Hold it. Keep the key on this board. Need the garbage.
Alright, for the sake of time, I'm going to assume that you guys have an essential question written down due to the fact that I don't see any pencils being moving around. Okay, again, here's just some pictures, some stuff. If you have that study guide out, some of this stuff is going to look familiar. Not everything on your study guide packet is going to be illustrated in the picture here. Just fine. That means you have a little extra additional research to figure out what those parts are called.
It's probably blocked.
It's probably needs to be a little bit more creative on the student side in terms of how they search for things.
I'm not sure either, right?
I'm sure you need to be creative with it. You should be able to-
Education is needing to be creative. I'm not just going to spoon feed you things. You're not a little birdie in the nest where I regurgitate the food up into your mouth.
Why not?
You have to learn how to go hunt for worms on your own.
I need to go
Did you
poke
specifically
my
blur
hole.
out those just for us to research it?
Did I specifically blur those out?
The grayed out parts with.
Oh, no. I did that just so that way it's not super confusing. Because sometimes there's additional parts on here that really isn't involved with the system we're discussing. Right? So I just want to, I color it so that way it just draws your attention. So it's like the arrow's pointing here, but it actually includes all the orange parts. Not just the middle one, if that makes sense. Right? 4 is pointing to this whole thing, not just this back portion of it. Okay, which is kind of fun. So, number 1, that's your bleeder screw. We talked about brake bleeding. Okay, every caliper is going to have one, so that way you can crack it open to force old brake fluid out or air bubbles. 2 is going to be your caliper guide pin, if your caliper is equipped with one. That's not always the case. 3 is your caliper piston. Calipers are going to have a piston. Sometimes they have multiple pistons. It's not just singular in some cases. 4 is your actual caliper. Then you got your brake line. In this case, it's the flexible brake line that's going out from our steel brake line to the caliper. Again, we do that because of suspension and steering movement. 6 is our brake pad. Brake pads. There's more than one. Now on your study guide paperwork, you're going to need to specifically name which brake pad is which brake pad. You can't just simply say brake pad 1 and brake pad 2. There are specific names on that. Okay? And then 7 is our disc brake disc.
I do believe that says rotor.
Yes, it's more commonly called a rotor. But brake disc is also another term that we can use for that. All right. KOEO, this is a term that you've probably seen before or heard of. Key on, engine off.
What?
Key on, engine off. This is a state in which we are putting the key into the ignition. We are turning it right before we start the vehicle. So the ignition
It's like the music's playing.
is on, radio is on, all the electronic lights are on, the engine is off though.
Ooh.
Okay? Basically, it's like flipping a switch when you enter a room. Lights are on, okay, but no one's home, kind of thing.
When you just turn it on.
Yes. You twist it. There's a couple different parts, right? There's an accessory, there's an on, or
There's an accessory. That's just like Windows.
yes.
Oh.
Okay. Okay, why do we want to specifically talk about disc brakes? Well, again, we want to cover some advantages of disc brakes.
I thought we were talking about drum brakes.
Disc brakes are more resistant to heat fade. What's heat fade again? Remind me, I forgot.
When something is so hot that it cannot absorb any more heat.
Okay, we're heat saturated. Right? And heat is the name of the game.
No.
We are wanting to produce heat to a certain extent. Okay, we also want to then dissipate that heat because we're taking kinetic energy from the movement of the wheels and transferring that over to heat energy through friction. Okay, disc brakes resist heat fade. They're harder to saturate when compared to what? When compared to what? What? Disc brakes are more heat resistant, or excuse me, more resistant to heat fade in comparison to what?
Disc brakes, or drum brakes.
Drum brakes. Okay, that's what we're comparing this to, drum brakes. Water fade, what? We didn't talk about that. What's water fade? Well, it's like heat fade, right? So, involve water.
Will the water fade be
Right,
like
imagine for yourself, you're driving and you're underwater, theoretically speaking. How much friction are we going to be able to add to that?
Yeah, so probably like none.
Probably none, right?
Water
Because
plate.
water can act as a lubricant. Now
Water
imagine
plate
you're
fades
driving
fine.
through a really deep puddle, right? And all of a sudden your brakes get wet. Now you're trying to generate friction. Not probably gonna happen because they're lubricated.
So water fade is when your brakes absorb water?
Well, it's not so much absorbing water, but when water gets on there and it prevents that from.
What about when
being
you're
there.
driving in the rain?
Well, the cool part about this is, okay, let's say we get some water on our brake rotors or brake pads, okay? As soon as I start to brake, I'm gonna start to produce some kind of friction, hopefully, if it's not too waterlogged. That friction heats up the metal, that metal will evaporate the water. Thus, we get rid of that water lubricant that might be on there. Again, so it can take some of that. Okay, but if I had a drum brake and I have a whole bunch of water in the drum, it's hard to evacuate that. All right, they're less apt to pull. What does pull mean? Well, when I hit my brakes and all of a sudden, right, the vehicle is turning left or right. It's being pulled into a direction. Okay, that's normally due to the fact that discs bind up. Disc brakes tend not to do that. Disc brakes will also automatically adjust for brake pad wear through the action of the square cut O-ring piston seal. We don't know what that is yet. We'll talk about what the square cut O-ring piston seal is. But the cool part is that it's self-adjusting. So as brake pads get thinner and wear out over time, due to the fact that we're causing friction, it's going to self-adjust, meaning that we're going to be always able to push that brake pad against the rotor, even as it wears. Drum brakes actually require adjusting periodically as the shoes wear on that. It's kind of fun. All right, disc brakes use a caliper to hydraulically move pistons that squeeze pads against parallel surfaces of a spinning rotor. That's how it functions. Nothing too crazy. This is, we discussed this last week, right? The rotor is spinning, kinetic energy. We take basically 2 pieces of bread, slap that on there, and we literally squeeze that rotor to slow it down. Okay, very effective way of doing things. It does take a lot of force, and this is why we use our hydraulic system or a power boost system to be able to generate enough force to be able to clamp that, to be able to create friction. Okay. All right, the caliper is mounted by bolts and brackets to the steering knuckle to stop it from rotating. So this is critical that you understand this right here. Okay, this was not on the first slide to identify these different parts. Okay, let me see if I can actually draw this. I've got a caliper. My caliper is right here. You guys see that?
Yep.
That's a caliper. Okay, let me get a different color here. This right here is not the caliper. That is the caliper bracket. Okay, they are different. It's important to distinguish the two, the caliper and the caliper bracket. So here's kind of the next step. The caliper is bolted to the caliper bracket. Okay? The caliper bracket is bolted to the steering knuckle. That means typically, again, I'm just going to say this generically because this is not always the case. I'm going to have 2 bolts that bolt the caliper to the caliper bracket. I'm then going to take 2 bolts, 2 different bolts, and bolt the caliper bracket to the steering knuckle. Okay?
Mr. Guest, can you do things like that?
These are typically 2 different torque settings. Okay? The caliper to caliper bracket torque is not very high. The caliper bracket to steering knuckle is almost the same torque as your lug nut wheel. General rule of thumb. Okay?
Why is there a mirror on here?
So that way you can actually see the bolt.
Oh.
It's okay. It's a small fixture to see. Alright, as we were talking last week with brake lines, we got steel brake lines that basically go from the master cylinder out to every wheel, but we can't complete that connection from the steel line out to the caliper due to the fact that wheels move up and down, they turn onto our front wheels, right? So we have a flexible hose. It is critical that when you remove the caliper from the caliper bracket, we do not just let that weight hang on that rubber reinforced hose. It will damage it. You will not see the damage because it's done basically internally. Okay? So what we typically want to end up doing is taking twine, rope, clothes hanger, S-hooks, whatever you got around, and you are literally hooking that. Let me see if I can draw a picture here. You can see the twine here. We're literally taking that, we're hooking it, and we're usually hanging it through our suspension system. All the weight of the caliper should be on this hook, not on the line. Okay? Let me see if I can get a different color here for this. Here's my hose, my brake line. That should be loose. Okay? At the same point in time, if we are to remove the brake line from the caliper, brake fluid is going to leak. We never, ever, ever pinch off that rubber hose to prevent that leak from happening. You will damage the hose, the line. Okay? The best thing to do is just to let it drip. It's gonna gravity bleed. Fluid's gonna come out of it like a leaking faucet. That's fine. We'll deal with that later. Okay?
Oh yeah.
We don't want to pinch that off. Alright, calipers may be either fixed, sliding, or floating designs. Disc brake calipers come in these 3 different flavors.
Flavors?
Right? You go up to like McDonald's, you're like, hey, I want a milkshake. Cool, what flavor you want? Vanilla, chocolate, or strawberry? That's typically your 3 flavors you get to choose from.
They have strawberry.
Okay?
Juice.
I have no idea. But I was saying, usually those are the 3 classic flavors you're going to get for milkshakes.
Pink Shamrock.
Okay? In this case, floating, fixed, and sliding are the flavors that calipers traditionally come in. Probably the most common type of caliper that you are going to find on most vehicles is the floating caliper. Okay, the floating caliper. Most common type. That doesn't mean you will not encounter fixed or sliding. Okay? You should need, let me put it differently here. You need to be able to identify these different calipers, visually speaking. Hey, I took the tire off of my car. Here's the caliper. I know what that is. Can you identify if it's a sliding, floating, or fixed caliper?
How do we learn that?
Okay? By learning through listening and stuff. Yeah, Simon.
Why is floating more common than the rest?
It's a easy design to work with. I would probably assume the characteristics of what we want how the caliper to perform is, generally speaking, where everything needs to be at in terms of things. Yeah, we'll just go with that one. All right, how can you compare these 2? Okay, the floating caliper is going to have guide pins. That is the telltale sign that you have a floating caliper, the guide pins. You know how I told you the caliper is mounted to the bracket?
Uh-huh.
On a floating caliper design, the caliper is mounted to the bracket through the guide pins.
That's crazy.
Okay? There's still bolts that go into it, but the guide pins then are allowing the caliper to shift back and forth during the braking operation. Okay? That's why it's floating design. A fixed caliper only has basically two bolts that are attaching the caliper to the steering knuckle. It does not have a bracket. Okay? The fixed caliper does not have a caliper bracket.
No bueno bracket.
Okay? The fixed caliper does not slide or shift back and forth under operation. It stays in place. It is fixed. It doesn't move. Okay? That's how you can tell if it's a fixed caliper or not. Okay? Again, I've got two bolts that are mounting that directly to the steering knuckle. Okay? Where the caliper, the floating caliper, the caliper is mounted to a bracket, the bracket's mounted to the steering knuckle. Fixed caliper, just to the steering knuckle. Sliding caliper. This has a bracket as well, but instead of having guide pins, the bracket actually itself has an area, right here you can see this, that the caliper is able to slide back and forth on. Okay? It is similar to the floating caliper design. The only difference is the sliding caliper will not have guide pins. Okay? The caliper actually slides on the bracket itself, not on the pins. Okay? So that's how you can tell the difference between these three. We'll get more into details later when we get into the lab about how to actually go in and service each one of these different calipers and brake pads. Okay, right now I just need you to understand there's a floating, fixed, and sliding caliper designs. Okay, most calipers are cast out of either iron or aluminum. They're a big chunk of metal. They do weigh a decent amount. Okay. On the inside of our caliper, it is finely honed or machined because pistons that are on the inside of that need to be able to move back and forth without any resistance. Okay, this is where the brake fluid is living. The piston's moving in and out. I want that to be machined and smooth. Less friction. Okay, and you can kind of see what that looks like. On the inside here, it's nice and smooth. Nice and smooth. This one you can't see because the pistons are in place still. But you can see that this particular caliper's got two pistons. This one's just got one, that one's just got one. Or at least in this picture, I think that actually has two. But. All right, the top of the piston is grooved. So again, the caliper has a piston that moves back and forth due to the brake pressure. The top of that piston has a little groove around it to accept the dust boot. Okay, there's a little groove in here. Okay, you can actually see here, here's my dust boot.
It's broken.
Yes, that dust boot has damaged. Okay, that's something we need to inspect and make sure it does not have. We want it to be solid and able to do its job. Okay, so as this piston is moving in and out, okay, this particular, let me get a different color here, this surface right here is what's making contact with the backing pad on my brake pad, and that's what's forcing that brake pad against the rotor, okay? Which means I'm extending out, coming back in a little bit, so on and so forth.
Can we have some
Okay.
visuals, please?
What do you think the dust boot is designed to do?
I bet collect and remove dust.
Not
Like a
collect or
gasket.
remove. Not to collect or remove.
Protect dust, kidding stuff.
preventing dust from getting in between the piston and the caliper. Because if I have dust inside my piston and caliper, that's friction that's going to wear out or pit or corrode the inside of my caliper. Now all of a sudden my brakes, the piston might freeze up and prevent it from going in and out and actually causing the brake pads to go against the rotor. That would be bad. Okay? So you can actually see here on this particular one, I have highlighted in magenta, there's a little like ring on this inside where the dust boot is installed onto the caliper, and again the piston has like a little ring for that dust boot to grab a hold of. Okay? When you are servicing brake pads, part of the process is to physically push this piston back into the caliper. During that process, you have to be very mindful not to pinch this dust boot as the piston is retracting back into the caliper. Because if you pinch that dust boot, you could tear and rip and tear it. Okay, which then allows obviously contaminants to potentially get in there. Okay, so just be mindful of that. And if you do ever encounter a caliper that does have a torn dust boot, replace it. Not the whole caliper, you can replace just the dust boot. Okay, it's not an overly complicated process.
Why isn't it like a dust crock?
A dust what?
Crock.
Dust crock? It's a
Yeah.
dust boot, right? Probably because Crocs have not yet figured out a way to monetize making money off of that. Okay, the other groove, because we have a second groove inside my caliper. What is that there for?
An O-ring.
Okay, machine midway through the caliper board. This is to allow the square cut O-ring piston seal to be installed on the inside of my caliper. Okay, so let me go ahead. This might look very familiar to your study guide, by the way, that you need to complete. So right here, number 8. What's that? That's the piston. Okay. What's this one right here, number 7? That's the dust boot. Okay. What's number 9?
This square cut old piston ring seal.
Yep. Okay. That's number 9 in this particular example. The square cut O-ring piston seal.
That doesn't look like a square.
Right? It's circular, but if you actually cut this in half and look at it, the cross section is a square.
Oh.
Okay. Now the dust boot prevents dust from getting inside in between the caliper and the piston. What does the square cut O-ring piston seal do?
Seal pressure.
Does 2 things.
Seals.
Okay? It obviously seals the piston. Actually, it seals the brake fluid inside the caliper. Okay? It allows the piston to move back and forth without causing brake fluid to leak out. Okay? That's its number 1 job. The second thing it does is the square cut O-ring piston seal also acts as a return spring for that piston. So as the piston is forced out, this square cut O-ring piston seal flexes, and then when you let off the brake, that square cut O-ring piston seal actually pulls back on that piston slightly, just enough to allow that brake pad to come off of the rotor. Okay? So again, if it's like this, my arm up here is the piston, and it pushes out, then that piston's O-cut ring pulls back. So every time that you brake, that piston is actually sliding further and further out because we're wearing on brake line material on the brake pad. That piston seal is just going to slightly pull that back. Okay? The square cut O-ring piston seal is something you will not normally see unless you disassemble all the parts from the caliper. So it's not something you would normally inspect unless there's a leak that's coming out of the dust boot. Okay? All right, we're going to end there for today. We're going to give you guys the last 2 minutes. Write down 3 questions. Open up your notebook. These are different questions than an essential question. Write down at least 3. You can write down more about anything that we talked about today. Okay?